Good morning. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word. I'm Barry Bryson, and we're continuing our study of the book of Ecclesiastes. We're in chapter 2, beginning with verse 1. As we have been saying, Solomon is describing the grand experiment of his life. This experiment begins with an hypothesis that everything in the world is ultimately temporary and meaningless. A vanity of vanities, a zero of zeros. And then he asks the question, what should we then be doing in this life that we have under the sun here on earth? And he has forbidden us to factor into the equation eternity. And he'll mention eternity briefly in the middle of this book, and then at the very end of the book will remind us that eternity is a reality, but it's not part of the equation yet. In fact, God really isn't part of the equation until the end of chapter 2. And then he describes his process, which is to use his life, his resources, his power, and his wisdom to find an answer to that question. What should we be doing under the sun, since everything here in this life is ultimately meaningless? And he's going to describe that process in greater detail today in chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. So let's read those verses. I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with pleasure, enjoy yourself. But behold, this was also vanity. I said of laughter, it is mad, and of pleasure, what use is it? I searched with my heart how to cheer my body with wine, my heart still guiding me with wisdom, and how to lay hold on folly till I might see what was good for children of man to do under heaven during the few days of their life. Heaven meaning the sky, not heaven above. Under the sky, under the sun. He's still talking about the closed loop of our existence. I made great works. I built houses and planted vineyards for myself. I made myself gardens and parks and planted in them all kinds of fruit trees. I made myself pools from which to water the forest of growing trees. I bought male and female slaves and had slaves who were born in my house. I also had great possessions of herds and flocks, more than any who had been before me in Jerusalem. I also gathered for myself silver and gold and treasure of kings and provinces. I got singers, both men and women, and many concubines, the delight of the sons of man. So I became great and surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me, and whatever my eyes desired I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure, for my heart found pleasure in all my toil, and this was my reward for all my toil. Then I considered all that my hands had done, and the toil I had expended in doing it, and behold, all was vanity and the striving after wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun. So this is his process, and it's quite thorough. This is one of the passages in which I am further convinced that Solomon is the one who is the source of this material, because there's no other king in the history of Judah, of Israel, that would fit this bill. Only Solomon. We have Solomon really compartmentalizing his life so that he's living a life, and he's in a sense standing outside of that life and evaluating it while he's living it. And he has withheld from his heart, from his life, from his physical body, no pleasure. And in the moment, those things were pleasurable. He doesn't deny that. But he describes the pleasure as just the end of it. It was its own reward in that moment, and then it was gone. He's going to talk about toil being its own reward later on, but in a positive light. This isn't a negative light. There's a big difference, and we'll notice what the difference is. It comes at a key point at the end of chapter 2. But he makes it clear that that these things that he's done, and there are categories of things that he's done, were ultimately unsatisfying and pointless. So he pursues pleasure. pleasure for its own sake, partying, hedonism, and he also pursues acquisition. So he gathers to himself all kinds of possessions, and then achievement, building projects, and some of the things that he's mentioned really did last. The building of gardens was in the ancient Near East the symbol of prosperity and power for a king. We think later on of the hanging gardens of Babylon, 500 years later, being the prime example of this. But he's building gardens for himself. Talks about building a reservoir. The reservoir of Solomon was still there in Jerusalem when Jesus was alive. The reservoir of Solomon was not destroyed until the Romans destroyed it in AD 70. And so some of these building projects that he's talking about were ones that actually did last for a long, long time, but then ultimately were destroyed, which would not have surprised him. He talks about the concubines and the pleasure that he took in having all these women, and in the things that were artistic that appealed to him, the music, and he said, I kept my heart from no pleasure. He also talked about the pursuing of this pleasure as work that is ultimately unsatisfying. And he found that all of these things, even being the best, I'm the best that ever was, maybe the best that's ever going to be, but so what? What does that even mean? And who does it even matter to? Because at some point I'm going to be forgotten, and these things are all going to go away. I think of the great Shelley poem Ozymandias, which describes a traveler seeing just the trunks of a statue that has been destroyed, and the shattered visage of the face that was at one point this enormous. And the inscription, my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings, look on my work, ye mighty, and despair, and nothing besides remains. That's what he's talking about. That's exactly the experience he is describing. He spent his life experimenting with every possible pleasure, acquisition, accomplishment, and achievement, being the best. Everything was ultimately pointless, and it was just work. And the fleeting pleasures that you took in the moment were there only for that moment. So he's going to ponder this realization. In our next verses, we'll pick up with verse 12 next time. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word.